Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, with the general election firing on all cylinders once again, Jeremy Corbyn has given his first speech of the restarted campaign. Speaking in London today, he focused on counter-terrorism and presenting what he described as Labour's different approach to domestic and foreign policy. Jeremy Corbyn said that no government can prevent every terrorist attack, but he went on to say that it is the responsibility of government to minimise the risk posed by terrorists. He said that under a Labour government there would be more police on the streets. He also said that the security services will get more resources if they need them. And Mr Corbyn said that in the view of many experts, there are connections between wars our government has supported or fought in other countries, such as Libya, and terrorism here at home. But he also said that his assessment in no way reduces the guilt of the terrorists. He went on to say that an informed understanding of the causes of terrorism is an essential part of an effective security strategy. And Jeremy Corbyn said that the so-called war on terror is not working. He said that a future Labour government would think of what he called a smarter way to reduce the threat of terrorism. Here's some of what the Labour leader had to say earlier.
We must be brave enough to admit that the war on terror is not working. We need a smarter way to reduce the threat from countries that nurture terrorists and generate terrorism. That's why I set out Labour's approach to foreign policy earlier this month. It is focused on strengthening our national security in an increasingly dangerous world. We must support our armed forces, Foreign Office, international development professionals and diplomats, engaging with the world in a way that reduces conflict and builds peace and security. Seeing the army on our own streets today is a stark reminder that the current approach isn't really working so well. So I would like to take a moment to speak to our soldiers on the streets of Britain. You're doing your duty, as you have done so many times before. I want to assure you that under my leadership, you will only be deployed abroad when there is a clear need and only when there is a plan that you have the resources to do your job and secure an outcome that delivers lasting peace.
That was Jeremy Corbyn. We'll be speaking to the Shadow International Trade Secretary Barry Gardiner in a moment. But first, let's hear from former Labour MP Tom Harris, who is in Glasgow. Tom, first of all, do you think it's appropriate to make a speech like the one Jeremy Corbyn has made today?
Yes, it's appropriate that we talk about the threat of terrorism. It's entirely appropriate that we have that debate because, frankly, we haven't really had that debate in the country so far. And if we're not going to do it in the aftermath of the terrible events in Manchester, then, you know, when else to do it? But I have grave reservations about the tone and the content of what Jeremy Corbyn is saying, because essentially, and I admit I haven't read every single word of the speech, I don't have a text of it, but as far as I can see from his reported comments, he's spoken a great deal about the culpability of the West, which is it's a theme that he has pursued for the last 30 years, and he said nothing at all about Islamism, which is actually the root cause of domestic and international terrorism.
Right. What do you say then to his broad theme that actually foreign policy, some of our foreign policy, could have contributed or does contribute to some of the violent acts that have been perpetrated in recent years?
I think he's buying into the Islamist agenda entirely. If you look at what ISIS themselves are saying, you know, ISIS are the most obvious representation of Islamism in the world. They actually have said unequivocally that even if you stop invading our lands, even if you stop torturing us and oppressing us, we will hate you, we will continue to attack you. Islamism is about hating Western values, it's about hating democracy, it's about hating the fact that in this country and in other Western democracies, women, heaven forbid, are allowed to leave their homes without their husband's permission, and that offends Islamists. And even if there were no invasions of any other countries, they would still hate us, they would still kill us. Can we remember that the World Trade Center was first attacked by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in 1993, 10 years before the invasion of Iraq?
But is Jeremy Corbyn right that the war on terror, to use that expression, hasn't worked?
Well, we don't know what level of terrorism we'd be facing if the particular military interventions launched in the wake of 9/11 had not happened. If anything, we have been far too tolerant of Islamism. We have we've kidded ourselves on that we can somehow negotiate with it, that we can come to some kind of understanding. Islamism is a dreadful death-worshipping philosophy which has to be defeated both militarily and domestically through policy, and there is no alternative to the end of this particular conflict.
But what, I mean, you voted in favour of the Iraq war, but has Jeremy Corbyn since been proved right by being against it?
I don't believe so. I mean, for a start, I mean, Jeremy offered the same objections to Iraq as, for example, he's given to every military intervention. In 1999, when NATO, led by Tony Blair, intervened in Kosovo to stop the murder of thousands of Muslim civilians, Jeremy Corbyn was there at the front demanding that military action should stop. And let's just think for a minute. If we stop our military intervention, what happens when the Islamists continue to kill our children when they go to pop concerts? What happens when we've done everything that the Islamists demand, that we've done everything that's the Stop the War coalition and its Socialist Workers' Party allies say? What happens when we stop sending troops abroad to do good, and yet we are still the victims of this evil philosophy? What do people like Jeremy Corbyn then say?
All right, Tom Harris, thank you very much. And I'm joined now by the Shadow International Trade Secretary Barry Gardiner, and Conservative Johnny Mercer is in the BBC's Plymouth studio. What do you say in response to Tom Harris, who has said that Jeremy Corbyn has bought into the Islamist agenda?
Look, I say not at all, because what Jeremy is pointing out, and he was very clear in the speech, that there is absolutely no justification for the horrific events in Manchester on Monday night. Absolutely none. Nothing can justify that, and there is no equivalence, there's no moral equivalence in any way between British action abroad and the terrorist action that attacked that concert. What Jeremy has pointed out, though, is actually in tune with what the US intelligence services have pointed out, in tune with what Stella Rimington has said, and in tune with what Eliza Manningham Buller have all said. Two heads, former chiefs of MI5. Eliza Manningham Buller says, whatever the merits of putting an end to Saddam Hussein, the war was also a distraction from the pursuit of al-Qaeda. It increased the terrorist threat by convincing more people that Osama bin Laden's claim that Islam was under attack was correct. It provided an arena for jihad for which he had called, so that many of his supporters, including British citizens, travelled to Iraq to attack Western forces.
So are you saying that the Iraq war is the piece of foreign policy, British foreign policy, that caused or in some way led to the attack in Manchester?
No, absolutely not. There is no direct causal relationship.
Right. So
and it would be
part of British foreign policy would you have changed to prevent subsequent terrorist attacks?
Look, what Eliza Manningham Buller is saying,
which I think, want to know what you are saying, yes, and what Jeremy Corbyn is saying.
And I believe it's the same thing. What we're saying here is that you cannot ignore the recruiting sergeant effect of those conflicts, and in particular the way in which those conflicts were conducted without having stabilisation in the country in the aftermath as the primary focus, because we know that these terrorist groups actually thrive on instability.
So would you have voted against airstrikes in Libya, for example? So you voted against it, and you're saying...
Let me be clear, Joe. I was one of the 13 people who did vote against the airstrikes in Libya. And look at what is happening in Libya today. Women are being sold in slave markets in Libya today.
Let's put that to
because of the complete failure to stabilise that country.
Let's put that to Johnny Mercer, because, Johnny Mercer, there has been a massive political vacuum in Libya, and Britain has been criticised for not having followed up the airstrikes that were conducted there. And, of course, Salman Abedi's family is from Libya. What do you say to Barry Gardiner's point?
I'd say to Barry and anyone watching that the Libyan intervention at the time was done on a very specific challenge of rescuing a group of people who were going to get massacred at the time. Yes, you know, what has happened in that country is of deep regret. You can see the challenges that are there, but I just do not accept that doing nothing is always the answer. I think Jeremy Corbyn's speech today, it belies a complete misunderstanding. These terrorists, they use that narrative after they've done something. You know, things like the World Trade Center, it all happened before Iraq. It's just making things up to get elected. And the fact that, you know, this guy could be Prime Minister in 2 weeks is just extraordinary.
Right.
Joe, it's not about doing nothing. Let's be absolutely clear. What Jeremy has always been clear on, and I think what many people in this country are clear about, is that military action, where it is sanctioned by the United Nations, where it is done in concert with other countries, and where it can have a clear plan to stabilise the country that is being attacked or intervened on, that is something that, I mean, you know, the one of the military interventions that actually Jeremy did support, of course, was East Timor, which precisely had all those bits in place. That was what the big conflict that Robin Cook resigned over about Iraq. Was it going to be sanctioned by the United Nations or not? And the point is this, in any of these conflicts, in Kosovo, what happened at the end was Russia had to be brought into play to make sure that we had the wider international community to broker a peace.
But Tony Blair went in on a humanitarian basis without a United Nations security, so Jeremy Corbyn would not have done that.
Indeed, he wanted at that stage to have a wider international involvement. And if you look at what happened in Kosovo at the end, that is what took place.
But in the end, as you say, that's your measure, it's going to be always that there has to be a United Nations security resolution before Britain will get involved in any military action.
No, not of course.
Well,
not of course if it's to defend an ally in NATO or if it's to stop this country under direct attack.
Right.
Those are separate situations.
Johnny, can I just move on? Johnny Mercer, the Labour leader, said that Jeremy Corbyn said that the UK cannot be protected and cared for on the cheap. And he's referring directly to the cuts that have been made by both the coalition government and the Conservative government since to both the police and our armed forces. And he's right.
He's not right at all.
Those cuts have taken place. I've got the numbers here in front of me.
OK, so counter-terrorism has been protected, hasn't it, since 2010. It's been increased since 2015. Since 2015, defence expenditure is going up. But the specific budgets that you're talking about, counter-terrorism and going against these threats, it constitutes a whole load of efforts, whether it's the Prevent programme, whether it's within the intelligence services, whether it's in the police, and you have a certain amount of money and you try and challenge what is going on and meet the threat that we are facing. So yes, you can say there are less policemen or there are less people in the armed forces. Does that mean we have less capability? No, it doesn't.
Right, OK.
If it was simply in numbers, then North Korea would have a fantastic army, wouldn't they? But they don't.
But isn't
and it misunderstands the problem.
But you can understand why the Labour Party is either, capitalising, if you want to use that word, on the fact that the Tories have long claimed that you are the party of law and order and the armed forces. When you look at the figures since 2010, the number of soldiers, for example, it's gone down from 102,300 to 78,600.
But Joe, I've just come back on this numbers figure.
Let me just finish.
Make sense.
Let me just finish. It's just that if you are going to talk tough after a big attack like this, and it looks as if we don't have enough boots on the ground, are people going to lose faith?
The issue with this counterintelligence fight is that a lot of it is kept from the public domain for reasons of necessity. The idea that, what we've done has contributed to a failure of the war on terror. I mean, it's not only pretty offensive to those of us who took part in it, but how could Barry or Jeremy or anybody else on this seemingly sort of magic roundabout on foreign policy ever think what the UK would be like without some of the efforts that we've seen from our brilliant security services who have been resourced? Yes, there are challenges around the economy that crashed under the Labour government in 2010. But how would anyone ever know what the UK would look like today?
All right,
I think it's pretty disingenuous. If you look at that war on terror and what people have contributed in this country for the freedoms that we enjoy, yes, one has got through in Manchester. It's desperate. It's terrible for the people there. But let's have a bit of reality. We live in a safe world, a safe country. We're very fortunate. We've got brilliant security services.
Right.
Yes, we must work harder.
Isn't it wholly disingenuous, Barry Gardner, to imply, or for Jeremy Corbyn to imply, that there is somehow a link between our intervening in conflicts abroad and terrorism at home, or that it has acted as a recruiting sergeant? How do you explain the attacks that have occurred in the Muslim world and killed thousands of Muslims? Is that our foreign policy to blame for that too? What about the deadly attacks in places like Madrid in 2004? they weren't involved in the Iraq war. It killed 192 people. You know, was that down to foreign policy?
No, look, let me be absolutely clear about this. The Islamist worldview existed prior to all of these things, and it is there. What Jeremy is talking about, indeed what Eliza Manningham-Buller and Stella Remington are all talking about...
I know you're very keen to try and bracket...
Well, what I'm trying to say is the radicalisation of young Muslims in this country...
as a result of British foreign policy.
Is helped by them using it as a cause célèbre. But let me go back to the point that you were making about the policing.
All right.
And
just a point of fact for our audience. Okay. Which way did you vote in the Iraq war? Was it for or against?
I voted in favour of going to war in Iraq.
Right. Well, that totally contradicts everything you have just said in this interview. So you voted for something that acted as a recruiting sergeant.
I did. And perhaps that was my mistake, but within 4 weeks...
It wasn't a mistake now?
But within 4 weeks of that conflict, I was in the House of Commons at the debate on the Tripartite Committee, arguing that we were not doing what we should have been about stabilising that country and leaving people from the army with their weapons to go back without any income, and that is exactly the chaos that we left behind.
Right, and I will pick that up with Johnny Mercer on the chaos. But please, no, hang on. Can I just finish? Because it's important to get the narrative here and the logic, because as we know, and as you have said, many attacks took place before the recent foreign policy interventions that have been taken by successive governments. No, but in terms of, are you saying that our foreign policy should now be guided, in order to avoid being a recruiting sergeant, it should be guided on not upsetting anyone? No, but if we're not going to have if we're going to have a foreign policy that's not, in your mind, going to act as a recruiting sergeant anyway, let's take Libya, for example, because actually the Manchester bombers' families were opponents of Gaddafi in Libya, and you might say that RAF airstrikes were crucial to him being toppled. And in fact, the Abedi family had fled Libya and come here to escape Gaddafi's regime. They went back to Libya. So in a way, they should have welcomed that intervention.
But they didn't. And actually what we had was a chaotic state in that country, which enabled the terrorist groups to set up their camps, to train people, to radicalise people through that warped ideology. The point I want to make, though, about the policing is that the police are the front-line intelligence service with our communities in the UK. We've seen so many young men from the UK who have become radicalised, who've become these terrorist bombers. We need the police on the front line, talking with the community, gaining their confidence, having that intelligence.
And was that not what the prevent strategy is supposed to do?
And on this occasion, we know that 4 or 5 times that was made, but it didn't get through.
Let me bring him others. I mean, one of the points that Barry Gardiner has raised is a valid one in the terms of the aftermath of these conflicts. Do you agree with him that actually in the case of Iraq and in Libya, Britain left, or the West left, these countries to chaos?
Yeah, of course. And we famously now know, and to the cost of many, that clearly what happened afterwards, the legacy, what should have taken place after Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, obviously, wasn't good enough, and we can only learn from that going forward. However, that isn't the reason why somebody decides to blow up small children in an arena in Manchester. Absolutely. And I think Jeremy Corbyn is, and Barry, you know this, he's on a hiding to nothing. I mean, to try and look tough and trying to be tough on defence-based issues. Look at his backstory, look at where he comes from, look at what he stands for. He's a pacifist CND member. He said he couldn't, when even asked by Andrew Marr, would you take out an ISIS member, he couldn't even say it. And this is a man that wants to be taken seriously on national security. And
isn't that the point, that this is a weak issue, actually, electorally for Jeremy Corbyn, because, of course, some parts of the press have talked about his past associations with members of the IRA or any connections that he might have with groups like Hamas. And in the end, it's a trust issue for the British people when they come to vote in this election.
I think, obviously, it's problematic when you look at Jeremy Corbyn's record in the past, referring to Hamas as his friends, associating with Jerry Adams within weeks of the Brighton bombing. These things will be perceived by people as suggesting that this is someone who sees the force of the British state as one of the bad guys in the world, and that's not a good look for someone who wants to be Prime Minister. But specifically on the speech that he's just made, the thing that I find problematic about it is it's all entirely retrospective, and as I said earlier, you can apply all sorts of different analytical frameworks to why we have the causes of terror, but the proposition he's actually putting to the public in an election campaign is we should have a smarter policy. Well, of course we should have a smarter policy, but I still haven't heard anything that articulates what that actually consists of. There's no diplomatic engagement with ISIS. There's no political solution actually available for negotiating with these people. So actually what he's offering is kind of an elaborate hand-wringing, and I don't really see what his actual proposal to the country is on this stuff.
And on that we have to end. Johnny Mercer, thank you very much, and Barry Gardner too.
I've been getting away.